So we have to move to the next speaker. That is Anastasiya Ihnatovich. She is a PhD candidate of Belarusian State University, and she will present the human rights and climate change from an international legal perspective.
So welcome everyone. Do you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So I'm very glad that I've been offered the opportunity to participate in the current session and to introduce you some of the results of my research. So in my presentation, I'll give you a brief overview of the climate change problem, mainly from the human rights perspective. So to start with, the 21st century climate change poses a global ecological challenge, which undermines ecosystems throughout the world. As a result, adverse impacts such as extreme weather events, increasing global temperature, as well as intensified floods and rising sea levels are indeed real, preventing persons from full enjoyment of a range of human rights. Among them are the right to life, to water, to adequate food and housing, as well as that to the enjoyment of the highest attainable standard of health. And given such unprecedented climate change impacts, the Human Rights Council has explicitly emphasized that climate change poses an immediate and far-reaching threat to people and communities around the world, thereby awareness to the complexities of human rights issues in the context of climate change. And it should be noted that the already recognized coherence between peace, development, and human rights in the context of human security discourse becomes particularly relevant in light of the acute climate change problem, mainly because the global debate on this problem has increasingly been revolved around the interconnectedness of human rights, security development, as well as ecological well-being. And that is what brings value added to the discussion of the present challenge of climate change, or precisely from the human rights perspective. As the existing academic literature and the international documents in this field haven't yet put forward sound solutions to the whole panoply of legal problems relating to the human rights and climate change discourses. In my research, I focused on providing a clearer basis for the following issues. So I'll first identify the human rights impacts of climate change using the examples of affected human rights. Second, I'll concentrate on the impacts of climate change response measures, or mainly with regard to the human right to development, and will then give you a critical review of such measures through the lens of the human rights-based approach. And finally, I'll provide you with some relevant suggestions and concluding observations in this respect. Given that climate change may negatively affect human rights in different ways, it should be mentioned that among the climate change effects discussed in the relevant literature are slow onset climate change effects, for instance, increasing global temperature, rising sea levels or desertification, and natural disasters such as floods and wildfires. And when it comes to the identification of the scope of human rights threatened by climate change, one should establish a causal connection between climate change effects, their impacts, and the human rights at risk. And to be more precise in this respect, now I'd like to focus on some illustrative examples in relation to both slow onset climate change effects and natural disasters. More specifically, with regard to the increase in global temperature, the analysis of a number of research papers allows us to identify at least such impacts as threats to public health, to coral reef ecosystems, to the development of reindeer husbandry, as well as those to fisheries and agriculture. As for the human rights impacts of this climate change effect, it should be noted that, for instance, our increased transmission of respiratory and infectious diseases caused by climate change-related increase in temperature may undermine the realization of the human right to life and that to the highest attainable standard of health. When we talk about coral reef ecosystems, which serve as the primary source of livelihood for indigenous peoples, it is relevant to note that their possible destruction due to increasing temperatures poses risks to the enjoyment of the human right to adequate food and cultural rights of indigenous peoples, especially of their right to the lands, territories, and resources which they traditionally owned, occupied, or otherwise used. As for the danger to reindeer husbandry emanating from the temperature increase, it manifests itself mainly through the reduction in snow cover, or thereby exerting problematic outcomes for the enjoyment of the right to adequate food and our cultural rights of the indigenous peoples of the north, such as the Inuit or the Sami, for instance. And finally, the increased temperature-related hazards to fisheries and agriculture may entail the same negative human rights implications as those already mentioned with regard to indigenous peoples. Moving on to rising sea levels, it should be mentioned that their adverse human rights impacts include primarily the risks associated with severe infrastructural damages and the submersion of territories of low-lying coastal countries. For instance, the destruction of infrastructure can pose a potential threat to the realization of the human rights to property and to adequate housing, which presupposes the availability of services, materials, facilities, and infrastructure. In its turn, the submersion of territories of small island developing states, such as Kiribati or Tuvalu, for instance, may negatively affect the right to self-determination, by virtue of which all peoples freely determine their political status and freely pursue their economic, social, and cultural development. Meanwhile, this climate change effect may interfere with the enjoyment of the indigenous people's cultural rights, particularly with the right to their traditionally owned lands, territories, and other resources. And in addition to these detrimental impacts, one should identify at least two possible implications, namely those related to floods and salinization of water. In particular, floods caused by rising sea levels may lead to increased cases of drownings, heart attacks, and other health disorders, which accordingly creates risks to the realization of the human right to life and set to the highest attainable standard of health. And with regard to water salinization due to sea level rise, it is the human right to water that may be infringed as well. As has already been recognized by the Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, one of the factors of the adequacy of water required for this right to be fully exercised is its quality, meaning that water must be safe, of an acceptable color and taste for each personal and domestic use. One of the most notable examples of natural disasters refers to wildfires, which may result in numerous casualties or significant economic damages to infrastructure, as well as in the loss of livelihood for forest-reliant indigenous peoples. And much the same as the previously discussed climate change impacts, those related to wildfires are highly likely to produce negative outcomes for the enjoyment of the human rights to life, to the highest attainable standard of health, to an adequate standard of living, to property, as well as to the indigenous people's cultural rights. And apart from the already mentioned climate change impacts, now I'd like to draw your attention to irreversible changes in ecosystems, which are proposed to be seen as a general impact for both slow onset climate change effects and natural disasters. Such impacts may impede mainly the realization of the human right to a healthy environment, which is of crucial importance in the context of climate change. Or to be more specific, a favorable environment is absolutely necessary for the human well-being and is essential for the enjoyment of life and of all human rights. And it is relevant to note here that the significance of this right in the climate change context is reflected in the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development and in the Paris Agreement, which are among the international legal instruments aimed at addressing the problem of irreversible environmental changes due to climate change. And in light of the present discussion of climate change and human rights discourses, special attention should be placed on climate change response measures viewed through the prism of their negative human rights impacts. To be more specific in this regard, one of the most severe impacts of actions to tackle climate change manifests itself in limitation of states' opportunities to achieve economic development mainly through natural resources-based industries, which is especially acute in the case of developing and the least developed countries. As a result, climate change response measures seriously threaten the realization of the human right to development, which is, according to the Declaration on this right, is an inalienable human right, by virtue of which every human person and all peoples are entitled to participate in, contribute to, and enjoy economic, social, cultural, and political development in which all human rights can be fully realized. Furthermore, this problem is exacerbated by the fact that the existing mechanisms to contribute to mitigation of carbon emissions are not efficient enough, For instance, so far, little progress has been made in relation to financing climate change mitigation in developing and emerging economies. And the same is also true for cooperative actions on the new technologies transferred to developing and the least developed countries. Hence, an appropriate legal framework is needed within which the acute issue of human rights impacts of climate change, when juxtaposed with those of climate change response measures, could be addressed. And now I'd like to focus mainly on the human rights-based approach, which is one of our current frameworks for combating climate change. According to a common understanding of this approach, all plans, policies, and processes of development should be based on a system of rights and corresponding obligations, which require states to respect, protect, and fulfill all human rights, including the right to development. And the special emphasis on this right is reiterated with regard to the climate change context as well, meaning that the mobilization of resources to address climate change should not compromise other governmental efforts to achieve the full realization of all human rights and the right to development in particular. Moving on to critical evaluation of this approach, it should be mentioned that according to the fifth assessment report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, human-made greenhouse gas emissions are the primary cause of climate change. And this fact is at the core of the human rights-based approach, as it requires states to reduce carbon emissions in order to comply with human rights obligations. However, the right to development implies the right to emit greenhouse gas, to improve people's livelihoods, and to raise their material living standards. Thus, a difficult question arises when it comes to compatibility of states' human rights obligations. So, on the one hand, there are states' obligations with respect to human rights threatened by climate change, which requires climate action. And on the other hand, there are states' obligations regarding the right to development, which is incompatible with climate change response. From this perspective, the implementation of the human rights-based approach may hinder urgent climate action. Meanwhile, if the countries of the world don't make the transition to a zero-carbon society, everyone will suffer the adverse effects of climate change. And this needs to be seen in light of the fact that the global average temperature is predicted to increase further by up to 6 degrees centigrade. And the likelihood of such a climatic scenario is evident from the current data, indicating that the carbon dioxide concentration in the Earth's atmosphere is still rising. As has already been mentioned, the international cooperation on climate change-related financial and technological support hasn't yet proved to be effective in terms of climate action at scale. And that is what highlights the relevance of striking a balance between development and the climate change response, mainly through limitation of developmental needs. To put it another way, it seems reasonable that precedence be given to climate change response measures, mainly because they are aimed at maintaining a favorable environment vital for the survival of both our present and future generations. And it is noteworthy in this respect that a number of international legal instruments, including the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, and the Paris Agreement, recognize the importance of protecting the climate and ensuring the promotion of an environmentally sustainable future for the present as well as for the future generations of mankind. The report addressed the problem of establishing an appropriate legal framework for urgent response to climate change. It is suggested that the human rights-based approach be interpreted as built upon the rights of future generations. And it should be noted that although universality is viewed as one of the constituent principles of the human rights-based approach, due consideration hasn't yet been given to the particular importance of its intergenerational component, namely to intergenerational claims for environmental protection in the context of climate change. More specifically, with regard to the practical implementation of this approach, it should be mentioned that this approach allows for the temporary restriction of the right to development, which would consequently result in reduction of carbon emissions. Meanwhile, it is absolutely essential to improve the existing climate change mitigation mechanisms and to develop new ones to ensure this right when reducing carbon emissions. And such proposal seems to be particularly apt in light of the climate change discourse, mainly because the long-term well-being of humankind cannot be achieved without climate action at scale. And finally, let me briefly summarize the key issues raised during this session. First, it should be noted that climate change effects pose challenges to the realization of a wide range of human rights, including at least those to life, to the highest attainable standard of health, to an adequate standard of living, to water, to property, to a favorable environment, to self-determination, as well as indigenous peoples' cultural rights. Second, apart from climate change-related effects, their impacts and the human rights at risk, there are threats from climate change response measures to the realization of the human right to development. And that is what appears to contradict the rationale underlying climate action at scale, and therefore calls for an appropriate legal framework for urgent response to climate change. And finally, it is concluded that the human rights-based approach under its common understanding is inconsistent with its essence, meaning that this approach cannot be applicable to all human rights threatened by both climate change and climate action. Or given that such an approach leads to contradiction between states' human rights obligations when it comes to its operationalization, it is suggested that it should be interpreted as built upon the rights of future generations. And this would help to address the problem of having to prioritize such obligations through the temporary restriction of the right to development, while improving the existing climate change mitigation mechanisms and developing new ones to ensure this right when reducing carbon emissions. And the rationale behind this is the urgent need for climate action at scale to avoid the long-term negative human rights implications of climate change. So thank you greatly for your attention. If you have any questions with regard to my presentation, I would be happy to answer them now.
Thank you very much, Anastasiya, for a great presentation. And just one question for right now from the audience. What role do you see that an organization like the United Nations have to ensure that we will have as few impacts and violations on human rights in connection to climate change?
So thank you very much for your question. It is a very interesting one. So from my point of view, in addition to a top-down approach with regard to climate change, it is absolutely essential to ensure that the bottom-up approach is also implemented. More specifically, we certainly need to change our lifestyles and to embrace major shifts in the way we live, for instance, through relying more on renewable-based technologies, through living car-free and using more public transport. So as you can see, there are a plethora of options everyone can choose from in order to reduce our carbon footprint, because unless we do this, we cannot achieve the long-term well-being of humankind. So I'm a passionate believer that what we really need to do right now in order to avoid the catastrophic effects of climate change, not only for the planet, but also for the people, especially for the future generations of mankind, is to completely change our mindset towards the understanding of the crucial need for combating climate change now. Perhaps this would be the way forward for us, not only in the short term, but also in the long run.
Okay. So in many states, you know that in many states, people just push their governments and their countries to do something, to take some kind of action. And do you think this is a good way to force states to take action?
Thank you for the question. Yes, indeed. So I'm totally convinced that it is absolutely essential to foster a greater awareness on the climate change related issues in general, and in particular those regarding the realization of human rights in the climate change context through different means among a wider audience, including the academia, the civil society, and the relevant stakeholders.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, I guess we don't have more questions for right now. Or maybe someone from the audience would like to know. Okay, one more. In many countries, no. Yes, one more, right?
Yes.
Do you think about any effects of what do you mean CC? Someone climate change. Okay. Do you think about any effects of climate change in human rights in Belarus, for example? And how can we apply human rights approach to national and local level and to shift from the view that it is only for developing countries and for far away?
So thank you for the question, but unfortunately, right now I don't have enough information to answer it full and properly, mainly because I've researched this question from a little bit different angle. But thank you very much once again. I think it will be very helpful to look at this issue from another perspective.
Okay, so one more question from Tim. We just take another question. What measures are used in Belarus for communication between different structures to combat climate change?
So thank you once again for your question. In my research on the nexus between climate change, response measures, and their negative human rights impacts, I focused on addressing this issue mainly from an international law perspective. Therefore, right now I don't have enough information with regard to particular measures are taken at the national level in order to combat climate change.
Okay, thank you. Well, so I guess we should stop here our discussion for today and continue next time. That will be quite interesting presentation from someone else from our BUP program. So I would like to thank you very much from the BUP Center in Belarus to all our presenters and to all our guests who participated in today's discussion and who participated actively, who reacted and so on and so forth. And for those who just were the guests and were listening, and I guess you enjoyed the talk. Thank you very much. So, and I have to give the floor to Madeleine. Madeleine, please, you would like to announce something interesting.
No, I thank you, Elena. No, I just also want to thank you here from the coordinating secretariat at Uppsala University. Thank you very much for arranging this, Elena and colleagues at the Belarusian State University. It has been really, really great this afternoon. And thank you all the speakers and the colleagues asking interesting questions. And I also want to say thank you to Pontus. I have him here next to me, but I want to thank him in formal more now, so you can listen to that I'm really, really grateful that he's working with this, and he's a very good coordinator for this event that is included in this 30-year celebration. So now we have ended the second space bridge, and there will be, is it 9 or 10 more, Pontus? 10 more. It's 10 more to come. And the next one, we hope that you will register for that, and that will be the 18th of March. And then we have the Kaliningrad State Technical University that will host that space bridge. And that one will focus on interdisciplinary solutions to sustainability issues in the Baltic Sea region. So that sounds very interesting. And I look forward to listen to that speakers and find out what kind of discussions that will come out from that. So I hope we can meet again then the 18th of March, and have a nice Friday tomorrow and evening and weekend and so on. And let's meet soon again. Okay, thank you.